Hello, I'm Chuck Martin, and this is the Voices of the Internet of Things. With me today is Ben Casey, CEO and founder of Spinifex Group. At Spinifex, Ben has been creative director in Sydney, Australia, vice president of digital engagement, opened the agency's studio in Los Angeles, and CEO since 2013. At Spinifex, Ben's focus is on state-of-the-art concept to completion content and using the latest emerging technology to innovate for major brands. Welcome here, Ben.
Hi there, Chuck.
I wonder if you could start by telling me about the Project Worldwide agency, and then we'll drill down from there just so our listeners understand the grander context.
Yeah, so Project Worldwide was formed in a response to the need for collaboration across a collection of our agencies. So, we have a number of different groups of disciplines in traditional advertising and strategic marketing, all the way through to music marketing and sort of specialist pursuits like our sort of technology-infused storytelling. And really, Project Worldwide gives you to go deeper in our sort of our core strength, and then really kind of leverage collaborations to put together sort of very comprehensive solutions for people who've got challenges for us.
So, do you act as a group? Do you act essentially like a holding company might?
Yeah, I guess it's the whole intent of it is really to kind of set it up as what they call the unholding company. I think there's a lot of challenges that have emerged, through getting sort of authentic and genuine collaboration between agencies in those big holding company structures, and so this has really been formed out of a lot of people putting their hands up genuinely and really kind of aggressively looking for the opportunity to focus on their core strength and get real genuine collaborations going between other people that have complementary skill sets, so that we can focus on being the very best in the world at what we do and know that we can actually provide really kind of holistic solutions through these really kind of genuine collaborations, which is kind of everybody's kind of signed in for this thing. It's actually working out really well for us at the moment.
And then, do you do things as a studio on your own, or your group on your own as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a really sort of varied and diverse background, and not all of that fits into the branded communication space, which is the main focus of most of the agencies in Project. And so one of our roles is to take experiences that we have, working for countries and cities and cultures and doing kind of quite exotic projects, and take those experiences and bring them to within the reach of branded clients. And so it does actually benefit us having direct-to-market clients, and especially sort of clients in unusual kind of territory that sort of expose us to ways of working and different techniques that you wouldn't get in the sort of the general flow of working with brands alone.
So your studio is really a creative studio. Where does that fit in the industry, in the grand scheme of the agency world?
So, I mean, traditionally studios like ours would have very much been in the sort of the vendor production company mold. But what we've seen in the last, 5 or 6 years in particular has been, this kind of flattening of the hierarchy. So traditionally, we would, work either alongside or directly for a traditional strategic agency. And now, as clients are sort of like turning their lamp back on everyone and saying, "Hey, listen, guys, this is a jump ball. Best idea wins." We're actually finding a sort of a niche space of our own. And that space, as we sort of analyze it, we've seen a lot of kind of consumer barriers go up against sort of communication in the form of advertising, and that's kind of created a whole new kind of set of agencies that are really sort of set up to respond with, content that's invited and welcomed, and a lot of kind of clever content plays, which is kind of like the wolf in sheep's clothing to some extent from a consumer's perspective, where the content, doesn't feel like branded content initially, so it seems more acceptable. And I think where Spinifex comes in its most recent era has been to generate potentially another option to that. We're seeing a lot of content plays, require a lot of media spend to help sort of keep them going. And I think, from us, because we come from an experiential background, we've never had the benefit of media spend to get our consumers engaged in the sort of work that we do. And so we've effectively sort of developed a very kind of authentic way of creating engagement through this kind of very unusual form of technology-based storytelling, which still seems to sort of connect with consumers, and they're interested, especially like consumers that are really hard to get to, like the younger ones who see this, and it's not only sort of invited and welcomed, it's really captivating, and that seems to be the role that we're playing for brands when they're willing to take a risk and say, hey, I want some genuine kind of engagement here. And this is something that is certainly not in my tool set anywhere else. And so that's where we started to come in direct with clients.
So is it only certain brands that get that?
Look, I definitely think our best work has been defined by CMOs that have been in a particular point of inflection in their path. Like CMOs that have significant challenges that they're willing to take risks to overcome, or just sort of people in companies and positions where that sort of appetite for taking risks and kind of taking on innovation is a little bit more part of the genetics, and so that tends to be the case. So I'll give two examples of that. We recently did a really interesting project with Acura, and that really kind of came out of a position where there was a recognition that it's really hard to get conquest customers for Acura again, and try and conquest customers from Mercedes and BMW and others. Yet, putting that same investment into chasing, sort of younger buyers who are potentially longer standing consumers, and also, don't have a lot of the kind of I guess traditional kind of, associations with the other luxury brands, is something that they wanted to channel their money into, and they were willing to take a risk in order to do that. So we created a rather unusual project, which was a biometrically driven driving simulator that was actually completely controlled by the users. And so it was really about sort of taking a lot of the messaging that existed around CES a couple of years ago around sort of human-machine synergy and, cars that bend at the will of the driver and the ability to read the emotional profile of the driver, and, take that, and rather than sort of get into the very, white noise, environment of CES where, I think everybody was really sort of telling that story a couple of years ago. We actually went to Sundance and created this machine that sort of really stood as the sort of the intellectual expression of that whole movement towards, the relationship between, the way that people, the machine is able to respond to the will of the driver, and and the future of Acura's technology. And it got a lot of interest, even though the audience in Park City was very small. Obviously at Sundance, the live stream of the experience, on the first day got 2.5 million viewers, because it was a really interesting way to articulate, that particular kind of technology.
With an approach like that for an Acura, how do they measure it? Do they still look like the traditional measurements of how many people came into a showroom or bought a car, or are they looking at a higher brand interaction measurement?
Yeah, I mean, we have lots of different engagements that sort of hit all the different metrics, going all the way down to sort of the return on marketing investments and matchbacks and things like that. But in this particular case, it was much more about getting in the consideration set of certain demographics that they're trying to attract. So a lot of the focus was on social media tracking, but also they did a lot of the media company did fairly significant analysis of placements and pickup and so on. And it was much more about brand recognition and sort of the different, I guess, cross-pollinated types of publications that they're getting into. Because I think traditionally, like the automotive press and the tech press will pretty heavily cover CES these days. And yet, they got into sort of like more creative forms of press and slightly more kind of into, sort of subcultural publications.
I looked at your reel. Do you do anything small?
We actually do a lot of small stuff. It's interesting because while on one end of the scale we're doing work that's literally sort of Olympic world record breaking scale, we're also characterized with work that sort of is based on mobile applications and location-based app experiences that are associated with sort of the ability to sort of have that sort of intelligence within a physical space. So yeah, we do things on a 7-inch screen, as well as we do things on very epic scales,
like Times Square. Can you talk about the Elton John project?
Yeah, it was a project that I guess it kicked off sort of last year, around this time of year, just a bit earlier, back in January last year. And it really, the essence of the project happened, the conception of the idea happened long before we actually met with Elton John's team themselves. So we had noticed a clause, a legal term, sort of starting to emerge in Hollywood contracts around this idea of post-biological performances. And it got us really interested. And it's coming off the back of, movie properties and franchises that are using, I guess, the likeness and body scans and face scans of actors like Paul Walker and Carrie Fisher and so on. And these individuals are so important, and especially if they wanted to do for living actors, prequels that require them to perform a different age of the role, or even in the case of having deceased actors that then can be sort of rematerialized back into movies to keep the continuity. This is something that's being is quite common now, and it really got us thinking. It was really kind of a mind-bending thought, this idea of the ability to assemble ensemble casts sometime in the future around sort of an Ocean's 17 movie or something. And we started to think about what the application of that could be, and then we very quickly got to the idea of the ability to experience epic moments in music history as if you were actually there. So like a U2 at Slane Castle, Beatles at Shea Stadium, and then obviously sort of Elton John had some iconic performances here in LA, and that really was the sort of the essence that got the sort of the project rolling. And we contacted Elton's team in London at Rockets Entertainment, and while they're out for the Oscars, they do the Oscars party every year for the Elton John AIDS Foundation, and we asked them if they'd come to the studio so we could share some of the thoughts that were beginning to sort of percolate here in our studio. And they were really kind of blown away by the thinking, and really intrigued because obviously sort of Elton's in his 50th, I think he just had his 50th anniversary of his performing career, and as we now know, what we didn't know at that point is he's also planning his farewell tour, and he's going to end his stage performances with this farewell tour. So it came at a particular pertinent time, and as we started to research this, we started to really uncover amazing capabilities in volumetric filming and more traditional kind of forms of visual effects that would enable us to sort of preserve the essence of Elton John for future formats. And the idea being that we really are at a line in history, one that's very similar to what we experience in the sort of the transition between photography and film, where there's an enormous kind of shift in the technology and by association the cultural impact that people that cross that line could have. And so as we look down the track, which we're constantly doing, we're seeing the emergence of these playback formats that are sort of fully dimensionalized. And so it really occurred to us that there's a lot of major sort of musicians that have only been captured inside the frame, and by association they kind of limit their legacy as they look to future ways to engage audiences or to play back their music, because they just don't exist. They just don't have the data to really kind of take advantage of these kind of volumetric formats that have this incredible sense of a presence and emotional connection.
Was it just coincidental that you contacted the Elton John team?
No, we had been aware of a project that was quite a long time in the future. It was actually a project that's planned all the way out beyond 2020. And it was an intriguing project to us because, as you look at what's happening with a lot of major acts, you see kind of, Roy Orbison and the Rolling Stones and Pink Floyd, they're all sort of like trying to capture this kind of moment in history, and generate their legacy. And so it really occurred to us that by 2020, the expectation for what those experiences will be and how people could go inside the world of Elton John or others and experience their sort of like most seminal performances like they were actually there would be a high expectation for that sort of experience. And so, we had been aware that there was some thought going on around, his legacy and how they planned for that. And so we contacted them on that basis. And like I said, it was kind of interesting because, we're doing a lot of kind of expansive thinking and sort of like coming to branded clients and different people around the world with ideas that are really intended to sort of really come to fruition, 3 to 5 years down the track. And it was really interesting to us. We've done a lot of work out in the Middle East, as you may have seen, working for sort of the rulers of the different emirates and We've also worked in China for sort of the government doing some really kind of very, very expansive and quite futuristic projects. And, we really enjoyed, working in that region, how quickly people are willing to adopt and accept new ideas. And it's quite a bold way of operating. And, when we went to Elton's team and Rocket Entertainment, they just have this kind of instinct that this is that these things are good ideas and that they're achievable, and it was really kind of interesting to sort of go to someone who's been such a creative force for 5 decades, and have him sort of very instinctively pick up on this is a really interesting way to extend his music and make sure that it sort of has that longevity.
So when you're doing these projects, is it really sort of betting on the come? Because you're sitting there basically as a team thinking of these things, but it's not like someone has commissioned it or bought it.
Yeah, quite often. I mean, the way that we approach our work is to focus on a process that we call end states. So what we do is we project all the things that we can see on the near and far horizon as it relates to technology evolution, and also specifically around convergence, because a lot of technologies really require other technologies to go through rapid evolution for them to become really relevant. So, for example, in this space, a lot of the work that we were doing was around kind of, as far out as we can look in terms of retina projection, the ability to sort of, take these experiences and bring them into people's living rooms in a very believable way. All of the technology that exists around playback heavily relies on a more streamlined ability for capturing the content. That's the part that hasn't been cracked yet. So what we do is we kind of project forward, and then once we got to the point where we're like, okay, we're pretty confident that we could plan on the fact that given the rate of evolution of certain strands of this kind of technology development, and as things come together, these are the sorts of experiences that we can, assume are going to be sort of somewhat commonplace or certainly achievable at a certain point. Then we work backwards and sort of like look at the dots that connect us there. And then, as we start to engage with clients in the branded space, or, someone like Elton, what we do is we share the moments in time that will get us to this long-term vision, which, in this case, obviously what we started with was this, very broad idea of the ability for people to be able to engage with Elton in a very realistic way using sort of a natural language AI and projection in thin air technology, and have this kind of very intimate experience with one of the greatest musical minds of our era, right? And be able to ask questions and be able to, sort of see, sort of the things that sort of inspired his music and the things that he cared about at the end of his life, and so on, and how he got there, and even be able to sort of get into execution of some of his music as well, like using today's technology. And then, as we started talking with them, they said, look, that's definitely of interest to us. But what's interesting is, we're about to start this process, and, we need to create sort of a global press moment that will sort of send shockwaves and not only, appeal to our loyal fans, but also really kind of, create a spark that lights the imagination of younger audiences. And so, we started to think about, what we could do today that would still be relevant on a path towards that longer term vision. So, today's technology was VR in this particular case. But the process that we used to generate the content created an asset of Elton that is relevant to all of the subsequent evolutions that will happen beyond VR as we go towards, sort of more advanced mixed reality interfaces to, sort of plasma holography and, sort of retinal projection. The key thing for us, not only was it about, generating this experience that people could have today, but also generating the assets and capturing the data on Elton that could be leveraged all the way into the future that will be relevant 100 years from now.
So is your approach to learn basically those roadmaps of the future and then be able to leverage it more than one time?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, it's really, we see a lot of people in our space and just out there, as we come across, different conversations and threads of these conversations that people are having with brands and with technology developers. And I think everybody's extremely focused on capturing the opportunity of this moment, right? And I think there's a lot of bad guidance as it relates to how to pick up certain technologies. It doesn't have this accumulative kind of benefit for the people engaging in this technology. So as much as possible, and we've had the benefit of working on projects like World Expos and large Olympic openings, where there is a real strong desire for people to project forwards, and also generate content and sort of keystone content that will have a lifespan well beyond the sort of the first use of it. So this was exactly the case here, and it was really a case of going, okay, well, if we need to bring this experience forward to this year, then we track this back, and these are the technologies we use. This is the way we'll generate the content, and this is what ultimately we generate as a sort of a legacy asset that could be used downstream. How do you get an engagement like the Olympics? I mean, how does that come about? Every time it's slightly different. We've done a few now. It's rather, I mean, look, to begin with, there's a relatively small community of people. It's kind of like a nomadic circus that moves around. There's a small group of people who have direct experience in this kind of very niche kind of experience of like delivering these shows. And so, everyone's pretty familiar with each other. And it's always sort of being assembled in slightly different configurations, although it's mainly the same players. What's unique about some of our experiences is, for example, with Beijing in 2008, there was a lot of press around, kind of the participants involved in that particular project. And then at a certain point, there's a lot of the sort of, I guess, the sort of the traditional players, kind of exited that equation as China were very determined to sort of use their own talent and demonstrate that they've got their own capabilities of delivering a show like this. And so everybody was out. We had sort of moved on to Shanghai, which had the World Expo in 2010. We were sort of kicking around opportunities down there. And actually, rather bizarrely, it was a bar conversation that sort of got us back into the fold between somebody working on the Olympics that was sharing with our technical director what they were intending to do. And actually, because of his unique, kind of exposure to this particular kind of and rather odd form of playback and generating content, he was kind of the studio that was generating the content, and there was a bit of a pause and hesitation. And at that point, we were brought back into the fold, and actually one of the only Western companies to be involved in that one. So, there is definitely kind of a fairly well tried and tested list of contenders for these things, but it can often be something quite circumstantial that sort of enables you to be part of that team. So that's just one example. But really, it's at certain points what it has taken is a significant risk somewhere in our path. So as I look back at Spinifex, for example, over the 20 years, it kind of splits into three kind of phases of our development. It was, and they kind of fall into childhood, which is like the early years where we were just like really kind of like sponges soaking up, doing a lot of branded communication, a lot of corporate comms, a lot of launches. And then as we sort of matured those things, we got to this sort of adolescent stage where, we were kind of rebelling a little bit against, sort of the more commoditized forms of our skill sets, like the production of commercials and post-production. And we moved into this very niche area through, I think it was around 2006, we did the Doha Asian Games. And it really did expose us to some extremely daunting challenges. And we were being asked to do things that nobody had tried before. And, we were really had a lot of confidence in our skills, and we were willing to take those on. And so it was sort of getting into that scene was really about taking a risk and really sort of backing our knowledge and experiences and understanding of how to do some of the stuff. And once we were in that sort of I guess it created it sort of lit a flame that we couldn't douse out. We were caught with the bug, and we tended to sort of travel with the circus and really try and get involved with as many of those expansive creative projects that we could. Do you ever come across a project where someone is saying we want to do this, this, and this, and you just say that this is a bad idea and just walk away from it? Yeah, quite frequently, to be honest. And often it's about sort of short-sighted applications of technologies, which we know that ultimately our greatest opportunity is to generate use cases that we feel of sort of, demonstrating the sort of, I guess, the, beyond the hype, beyond the disillusionment that, naturally follows that, what's the sort of the productive use of these technologies. And so, it really does benefit us to select projects based on, appropriate uses of technology. And if things sort of smell to us a bit faddish, we'll tend to sort of pass on that. We also ethically we pass on certain types of work on the basis of how persuasive this form of communication can be. So we tend not to get involved in military-based work and so on.
How do you keep up as a group?
Really, it's about sort of constantly putting ourselves in the line of fire. Like I said, when you're involved in these, large, epic projects, you get to sort of rub shoulders and collaborate with the best in the world in their different crafts. And, we learn a lot through that. So we have a very deliberate strategy of taking on what we call these moon projects. And they really kind of operate, very much like the early Apollo missions, where, we, by necessity, have to have this kind of massive catalyst of understanding and learning. And, and we get to sort of, prove to ourselves certain techniques. And then we use those techniques in the footprint for a lot of the work we do in the branded space, where, I think clients really value the idea that, while they are dipping into something that's never been seen by a lot of consumers before, that there is kind of a proof point behind it, and it's not, ultimately it's a calculated risk. And so, really it's about sort of ensuring that we continue to either develop our own projects, and like in the case with Elton, or get involved in and qualify to be involved with, very talented teams that really give us that sort of high level of exposure to what's going around.
These days, where do you see the status of VR and AR?
I think it's in a really dynamic phase at the moment. I mean, as things started to emerge with different technology and headsets coming out, you could see the gradual movement towards a more natural experience. So, going from a relatively passive look around to something that includes your hands, to the ability to get that sort of 6 degrees to freedom, it's come along. And what really kind of excited us in our studio is that, these days headsets are coming out that we don't even see coming. I mean, usually you can see these videos that emerge or Kickstarter, and then you start to sort of understand what the innovation pipeline is around these things. But we're seeing things pop up every 3 months, some of which, they're completely ready for prime time and very robust technology, but we didn't even see coming. So the speed of evolution is really exciting. And I think, what's important now is I think, a lot of people have experienced, we look at everything through the lens of the hype cycle, and definitely there was enormous hype around these technologies, and there has followed incredible disillusionment from a lot of people as they've engaged with kind of SDK level applications of it and relatively sort of cliche applications of the technology. And now I think what we're seeing is people sort of on that sort of path to enlightenment in terms of, where the true applications of this stuff is. And for me, the reason we sort of were excited about this Elton project as we started to get into the sort of the near-term opportunity is this capacity of in two ways, giving people the experience of being actually there, like this sense of presence. We got it through recreating his 1975 concerts, so that you could literally travel back in time and experience those seminal moments, as if you were there on stage with him at Dodger Stadium, and that was kind of an amazing thing to watch people's reaction to, including Sir Elton's himself, but also. With the way that we executed the live experience that was multicast to different venues in LA and London, where the audience watched the whole show, and rather than coming out of the VR experience like the folks in New York, they stayed in and watched the remainder of the show as a VR live stream. And that was really kind of interesting to me because, they got an experience that when I went back and sort of looked at the video on demand of it, it was a really powerful experience of a concert, and also of an intimate Q&A with a rock legend, and it sort of proved to me that that there is amazing applications from being able to get people closer to people, their heroes, or people they can learn from in a really profound way.
Thank you, Ben Casey, and thank you all for listening to the Voices of the Internet of Things.
Thank you, sir.